really, really blessed to be able to share today. And I want to thank Heidi and Kaylin for this opportunity. We have a very little fellowship here. And recently we've been watching some teaching series online. So I haven't been teaching much. So if I'm a little rough on the edges, I know I'll have a lot of grace here. But my teaching today is titled Vashti or Esther. And we're going to be in the book of Esther. We're not going to move out of the book of Esther. So we're going to stay real concise to that. In the book of Esther, in the red thread, Jesus Christ is the savior of God's people. So the book of Esther's key verse is in chapter 4, verse 14. And there you see how the whole book revolves around Jesus Christ as the savior of God's people, representative in Esther. And I think it's wonderful that God gives us women in the Bible to study and see how to live and believe and walk with the Father. And yet the word God is never used in this book. Very interesting fact, but it's never used in this book. And Esther was originally a separate book. All of them were. There's several books of the Bible, and they were all originally separate. And I like to think of Esther as God's special little tome, Tome. And by the way, an excellent movie is One Night with the King on this book, Esther. There's some controversy about the era that it takes place in. Two sources have like a 50-year separation, but it took place. And many times you try and find out who wrote a certain book. There is no known writer for this, but it almost reads like a Shakespeare play. I think he must have written The Taming of the Shrew after reading Esther. But Esther and Vashti are two very significant women in this record. And Vashti has a short appearance from the record that we're going to read, but she has a very big impact. And there's several similarities between Vashti and Esther. They are both of exceptional beauty, just beautiful women. Both were spoils of war, and I'll explain. Vashti's father was the king of Lydia. His name is Alytus. He went to war with I can't say his name, Ahasuerus' dad. They ended up in a 6-year war, and Lydia is in northwest Turkey. Well, the war comes to a draw because there is a solar eclipse. So the war is called the Battle of Halys, Halys, or the Battle of Eclipse. So the solar eclipse happens and everybody just goes, whoa, because they took that as a terrible omen. And so the battle comes to a draw. So King Alytus, however you say all these names, I'm sure I'm hatching them to pieces, gives his daughter in marriage to Ahasuerus, who is the son of the other king, who has not come into office at that time. So, which was common. You always built alliances if you could. Esther, even though she's born in Persia, is considered a spoils of war because her parents were carried away by the Persians when the Persians overran Babylonia. Both Esther and Vashti would have to call upon wisdom to maneuver through the Persian courts. And if you've ever studied history about India or Persia, their courts were just full of intrigue, alliances. They were just very, very difficult. They had several levels of authorities. I mean, it's just almost impossible at times. And especially if you study any kind of British history when they were in India, it was just sometimes a joke how devious they could be and very difficult to maneuver through. Both Vashti and Esther would make a crucial point in time decision that would have a snowball effect, one to the good and one to not so good. And both would exhibit their trust and confidence or lack thereof in their king. So those are their similarities. And there are some marked differences. Because of Vashti coming from a kingdom, daughter of a king, she was born and groomed for her step into royalty. She was prepared to be a queen. She had extensive training and she would know how to comport herself, and she would have an advantage of how to work through these court systems and watching her own father and living in his court. Esther, on the other hand, had on-the-job training. But it speaks very highly of her upbringing by her cousin Mordecai in how she comported herself and how she applied herself to learn as much as she could to be as effective as she could in this court. And I also want to point out that they are living in the enemy's territory. And yet, just like several records in the word, we see how they worked within that system. They didn't take to arms. They didn't cause uprising and rebellions. They worked within that system. Now, Esther opens in chapter 1 is where we're going to go. And we're going to look at Vashti first. She's the first lady on our list. So chapter 1 through 22 is where I'm going to go on this chapter because it's full of information. And it says, now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this is Ahasuerus, which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia over 127 provinces, a large territory. That in those days when the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the palace, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all his princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces being before him. When he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days. So 180 days, he's doing a series of feasts. He didn't feast everybody at once. He would have a series of feasts, and each one would have a specific set of the hierarchy of his princes and the noblemen and such as that. So when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present in Shushan, the palace, both unto great and small, 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. Well, of course, this Shushan had hosted all these others from these other regions. It's a huge undertaking every single time you have a feast. So it's very nice that he's hosting a feast for those of his own palace who had done all this hard work. Verse 6. Where were white, green, and blue hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rings and pillars of marble. The beds were of gold and silver upon a pavement of red and blue and white and black marble. What a mind picture. So it was very, royal. It was like, instead of carpets to sit on, they had the beds. I mean, this was done very well. He was giving them a very sweet reception. And they gave them drink in vessels of gold, the vessels being diverse one from another, and royal wine in abundance, according to the state of the king. They were having their Friday night fellowship. And the drinking was according to the law, none did compel. Now, there's a lot of interesting information in Freeman's Manner and Customs. So I exhort you to avail yourself of that, because that has meaning here in this verse. But I don't want to take up all that time. For so the king had appointed to all the officers of his house that they should do according to every man's pleasure. Verse 9, Vashti comes on the scene. Also Vashti, the queen, made a feast for the women in the royal house, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abigedes, Zethar, Carcass, the 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, to bring Vashti the queen before the king and the crown royal, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on. But the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth and his anger burned in him. That was a bad political move. For whatever reason, it's never given. It was a bad move. And I think Vashti probably came to rue it. Verse 13, then the king said to the wise men which knew the times, for so was the king's manner toward all that knew law and judgment. And the next unto him was Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshith, Meres, Mersena, and Memucan. Notice then that Daniel, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego are gone. They had probably passed away by the time this record comes, because they had very high seats in the Persian kingdom also. So these guys are the 7 princes of Persia and Media, which saw the king's face and which sat the first in the kingdom. Verse 15, what shall we do under the queen Vashti according to the law, because she hath not performed the commandment of the king Ahasuerus by the chamberlains? And Memucan, there's always going to be one that speaks up right away. Yeah. He answered before the king and the princes, Vashti the queen hath not done wrong to the king only, but also to all the princes and to all the people that are in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus. For this deed of the queen shall come abroad unto all women, so that they shall despise their husbands in their eyes when it shall be reported, the king Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought in before him, but she came not. Yeah, it would have long, far-reaching repercussions. That's why it was a very poor decision on Vashti's part. Verse 18, likewise shall the ladies, and that ladies there should be the princesses of Persia and Media, say this day unto all the king's princes which have heard of the deed of the queen, thus shall there arise too much contempt and wrath. If it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it be not altered. And this was the standard for anything that he wrote. It would not be altered. It would not be stopped. It would not be changed. That Vashti come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. And when the king's decree which he shall make shall be published throughout all his empire, for it is great, all the wives shall give to their husbands honor, both to great and small. Da-da-dan. And the saying pleased the king and the princes. Yeah, I bet it did. And the king did according to the word of Memucan, for he sent letters into all the king's provinces, into every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after the language, that every man should bear rule in his own house, and that it should be published according to the language of every people. Very interesting that you have to write a rule. But that's what he did. I believe the king was played. He was set up on very quickly with bad advice, but he took it and he issued his decree. And we will see in chapter 2 that Vashti is indeed removed, and an opening opens though. And this is where wonderful little Esther comes on the scene. And I have to again remind you that these courts were full of intrigue. Everybody was looking to their own advancement. They wanted to line their pockets. They wanted the power. The king could trust virtually nobody. It took some time to learn it at times, but eventually they wise up that they can trust nobody. So when they found somebody that would give them the truth and would always speak to them honestly, they treasured them. And that's who we're going to find Esther turns out to be for this man. So now we're going to look at our wonderful Esther. So in chapter 2, we're going to read verses 1 through 17, and then we're going to skip through and wrap it up. So I hope not to be too much longer. But it's a wonderful story, and I don't want to short Esther. After these things, chapter 2, verse 1, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king. Now remember, he wrote his decree, so he couldn't change it, couldn't go back at it. So they want to assuage his loneliness and his sorrow. And let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins unto Shushan the palace, to the house of the women, under the custody of Hegi, I don't know, the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let their things for purification be given them. And let the maiden which pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. Now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shemaiah, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, which reminds me of Saul. He was a Benjamite, first king. So verse 6 says, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity, which had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. So it gives you a real quick, concise history. And he brought up Hadassah. Hadassah is Esther's true name. Hadassah means myrtle, like the tree, a myrtle tree. And the myrtle tree was a symbol of peace. So it says a lot about how she's named. Well, that is Esther. And it says his uncle's daughter. So Mordecai was cousin to Esther, but there's some years difference, obviously. For she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So Mordecai takes under him her upbringing. So it came to pass, verse 8, when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together unto Shushan the palace to the custody of Hegi, that Esther was brought also unto the king's house to the custody of Hegi, keeper of the women. And the maiden pleased him. And I was talking about Esther, pleased this chamberlain. And Esther obtains kindness of him, and he speedily gave her things for purification, which such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens, which were meet to be given her out of the king's house. And he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. Look how quickly she is advancing. It is tremendous how she must have applied herself. Speaks very highly of it. Now, verse 10, Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. Mordecai is very wise here. He wants Esther to be weighed on her own merits. He did not want a presupposed disposition had against her. So he was like, look, keep this quiet. You know, you go about, and she's very wise in heeding what he says. So verse 11, and Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did and what should become of her. Verse 12, now when every maid's turn was come to go in to King Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months, according to the manner of the women, for so were the days of their purifications accomplished, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet odors, and with other things for the purifying of the women. I wouldn't mind having a 12-month massage. I wouldn't mind having a little bit of party attention like that. That'd be really sweet. Verse 13, then thus came every maiden unto the king. Whatsoever she desired was given her to go with her out of the house of the women of the king's house. In the evening she went, and on the morrow she returned into the second house of the women, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines. She came in unto the king no more, except the king delighted in her, that she was called by name. Verse 15, now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come to go in unto the king, she required nothing but what Hegi, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed. So what's that really saying is she asked him, what should I take? Now this is a king's chamberlain, and I can guarantee you he's going to have the inside skinny on what's going to be the best thing. So, and Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. Verse 16, so Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus into his royal house in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. So this is the month of January, and it's been 4 years since Vashti was deposed, because that was the 2nd year. No, 3rd year, and this is the 7th. Verse 17, and the king loved Esther above all the women. And she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. What an astounding rise. We could call it meteoric in our day and time. And she deserved it. She applied herself. She worked diligently. She heeded the wisdom she was given. Well, if you've ever read the record of Esther, you know that things start to transpire. The evil Haman comes upon the scene. He does not like Mordecai, so he starts this real devious, twisted attack on Mordecai. And in how he sets about the start of it is he whispers in the king's ear that there's these people in the kingdom that aren't doing the law, and it's all total blatant lies. But the king, again, not checking, it just goes to show that when someone whispers something in your ear, check it out. Don't necessarily take it for truth, but he didn't. He took it for truth, and he issues his decree. And it basically says, okay, you can kill all the Jews. On the certain day, you're just going to rise up and we're going to kill all the Jews. Well, Mordecai, of course, finds out about it, and he's just horrified. I mean, he rents his clothes. He's just, it destroys him for a moment. And so Esther finds out that he's so upset. So she writes to him and she goes like, what's going on? Why are you doing this? She tries to send him things to make him happy. He returns all of them. He doesn't want any of them. He's basically already grieving. He's very, very upset. And so she finally says, okay, what's going on? So in chapter 4, in verse 7 is where we're going to go. And we'll read this section through chapter 5, verse 2. So Mordecai tells him, she sends a chamberlain over to him to find out. And Mordecai told him of all that had happened unto him and of the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the Jews to destroy them. And he gave him the copy of the writing of the decree that was given at Shushan to destroy them, to show it to Esther and to declare it unto her, and to charge her that she should go in unto the king to make supplication unto him and to make request for him before him for her people. And Hathach came and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Again, Esther spoke unto Hathach and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever man or woman shall come into the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king for these 30 days. And they told to Mordecai Esther's words. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. Otherwise, look, being in the king's house isn't going to protect you from what's coming. It is not. You will not live. And he says, for if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. God's going to deliver his people. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. But because you didn't speak up, you won't make it. And this has got to be revelation. Because why would Mordecai issue such harsh words? But God bless that man for having the strength to speak them, because this was his daughter. He took her as his daughter. And then his immortal words, and who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Those are the words that Jesus Christ would remember when it came time for him to be the savior of God's people. And it's just, you talk about something that strikes deep at the heart. I can imagine Esther's legs probably felt like liquid. Her heart must have been beating up a rhythm in her chest, because she basically, if she doesn't get extended that scepter, she's going to die. But Mordecai had told her, if you don't, you are going to die. So, I mean, either way, I'm going to die or I'm going to die. I might as well die doing something big. But she's very smart in what she does, because Heidi had talked about prayer and about how important it is and how we reach out and cover for each other with prayer. And she requests this. So Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer. Verse 16, go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan and fast for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days and night. Isn't that interesting? 72 hours. That's a correlation too. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. If I die, I die. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. And all of the folks, the Jews in Shushan area, prayed, fasted, didn't eat, didn't drink, 3 days, 3 nights. They prayed for this woman. Boy, can you imagine how that must have bolstered her, the spirit upon her, how that really just, that's like a Samson in female form, the strength, the heart that she would have had. Her name meant peace. God's giving her peace. The best way he knows. He's given her great encouragement and wisdom, and now he's given her the full support of those in her realm, her sphere of influence, the fellow Jews. Chapter 5. And it came to pass on the 3rd day that Esther put on her house robe and her slippers and left her hair in curlers without any makeup on. Oh no. She dolled herself up. She got her best clothes on. She put her nicest stiletto heels on, the nylons with the line up the back of the leg, all those wonderful things that women do to make themselves more appealing. Nothing wrong with it. Nothing wrong with it at all. So she puts on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house. Her hair was done beautifully. Her makeup was perfect. She had on all the right jewelry. She did it right. Over against the king's house, and the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house over against the gate of his house. Verse 2. And it was so, when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter, so she would not die. He had given her life. He had seen her standing there and extended to her life. He didn't know why she was there. He would ask and he would find out later on. I mean, quite a flurry of activity happens between this point and the end of the book of Esther. I encourage you to read it. At one point, the king, when Haman's there with him and Esther in the banquet, rises from the couch and leaves the room. And that action is a death sentence. Once the king does that, you will die. And Haman angered the king so much, he left his couch at that banquet, and that was it. That's why Haman knew evil was meant against him. But Haman deserved everything he got. He built his own death sentence. The man was just incredibly evil. Go to chapter 9 and we'll close up here. Chapter 9. Because Esther was memorialized every year. Every year this book is read during Purim, which is when they were supposed to murder all the Jews. Now the king couldn't change his decree, but what he did was wrote another one that said, they're coming for you, but you have my permission to fight back. And they were able to save their own lives because he gave them permission to fight back. Esther's effect on this king was far-reaching to the point it affects Ezra, Nehemiah, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. I mean, it's just amazing. She brought this man great peace. She worked very diligently to always be the best for him, which unfortunately Vashti showed the absolute reverse. She did not trust him. He did not have her confidence. And that's something else that Heidi has exhorted us in, is have great confidence in God. Well, to a woman in this era, the king was her God. Her husband was her God. So, and they called him Lord. Chapter 9, verse 21. So this is the establishing of the memorial that Esther's book, Esther's story, would be read every year. And it happens right before Passover, about the middle of March, end of February, middle of March. So that's interesting too. Verse 21 says, to establish this among them, that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar and the 15th day of the same yearly, as the days wherein the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month which was turned unto them from sorrow to joy, and from mourning into a good day, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and of sending portions one to another and gifts to the poor. In verse 26, wherefore they called these days Purim, after the name of pure. Therefore, for all the words of this letter and of that which they had seen concerning this matter, and which had come unto them. So, Esther or Vashti? Everybody has the option of choosing. Which are they going to be? We are Esther's. We choose to do the Father's will. We have confidence in our Father. We have confidence to speak truly, live truly, love truly. At times it's harsh on those that we love to have to speak to someone something difficult, but it's the most love that you can extend. And this woman is memorialized through all this time. The Jews to this day read this record. Esther was a young woman. She was extremely beautiful, very talented, but the one thing she did was she won the heart of a man because she brought him peace and she had confidence and trust in him. Who knows whether this is what you're born for in this day? We are born to our specific time. God needs us. The Jews nation needed a woman to stand. God needs us. He needs us virtuous, valiant, strong, and he will do everything he can to make sure we are. God bless you. Thank you so much.